All right, we are continuing our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks, and we are up to the book of Judges. And last week, as we looked at the book of Joshua, it was a lot about victory and a lot about not perfection, but general faithfulness to God. This book is pretty much the opposite of that. It shows the great wickedness of mankind. And so we'll get to this here. And so we're going to, if you have your outlines there and you want to just follow along, we'll start here. First of all, we'll just kind of look at the overview there. And this is the 7th book of the Bible in the Old Testament. It's got 21 chapters, and it is a history book. It is telling the narrative. It's telling the history of how things took place in the history of the nation of Israel. So just to bring you up to speed to where we are, you have Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of slavery. You have Joshua bringing the people of Israel into Canaan and bringing them into the promised land, and they spend a long time conquering the land and dividing up the land and dividing the tribes up there. And now they are settled into the land, and we have entered into the time of the judges. And judges were just a group of people, a series of people that led Israel. They weren't kings, but they were leaders in Israel here. So that brings us to the structure of the book here, and this is again part of those Bible outlines that you can pick up here if you want to get copies of this. And so you have as you go through these different sections here, you have the tribes refuse to drive out the enemy. You have the Deborah and Gideon, some of the first judges. Then you have Deborah and Gideon. You have the story of Abimelech. We'll talk about him. You have some more of the judges, Tola, Jair, down through Abnon. Then you have Samson, and then you have a civil war that takes place. So these are a bunch of judges, and everybody fighting against each other and falling into false worship. So it's a real uplifting book, but there are some things that we can learn from it here. A key verse that you'll find in the book of Judges, and it shows human nature for what it can be. Key verse is this, Judges 21:25. It's the last verse of the book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So nobody followed the Lord. Nobody did what they thought the Lord would want. They did as they saw fit. Everybody turned to be a god unto themselves. And that is the natural way that human nature can go. So we're going to go through the outline of Judges there. If you want to fill in there, the first outline there, the era of the judges explained. And this is chapters 1 and 2. So chapters 1 and 2 give you a little bit of a background and lead you into the series of judges here. So in chapter 1, there are a series of battles that take place. And just like in the book of Joshua, the command was that the people of Israel were to drive out the inhabitants of the promised land that they were entered into. So the people that had inhabited this land, they were guilty of all kinds of horrible acts of sacrificing children, all kinds of just detestable acts of false worship and idol worship and those types of things. So it was a series of battles here that they began to fight, and then also it lists in this first chapter Israel's failure to completely drive out the enemy as they were commanded to do. And mentioned in this chapter are 9 out of the 12 tribes in their failure to win a total victory in driving out the enemy as they should have. And so you've got, and I'll just list these out, Judah and Simeon, the Benjamites, Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. You've got those 9 that are mentioned by name as they are having different battles. So they fought a battle, but they didn't completely drive out the enemy. Each one of those, one by one, it lists those out. There are 3 that aren't mentioned by name, Reuben, Issachar, and Gad. And again, it's just assumed that they likewise failed in their endeavor to drive out the enemy completely. So each of the tribes faced a particular enemy. At no time was the entire nation, like all 12 tribes, together fighting the same battle together. So you might have a couple of tribes fight a group in one area, another tribe fight another group, another. Sometimes a couple of tribes will band together and fight a certain group of the Canaanites. And so you have these skirmishes that are taking place, but they never did completely drive out the inhabitants of the land. So that brings us to chapter 2, where we find this angelic rebuke in Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And so if you have your Bible, you can just follow along, and I'll read through these here. Judges 2, beginning in verse 1. It says, "The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land. But you shall break down their altars, yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called the place Bochum, which means weepers. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord." So again, they didn't drive out the people like they were supposed to. They made alliances with these pagan nations like they were not supposed to do. They worshiped their gods like they were not supposed to do, and God rebukes them for this. Now, then, near the end of this chapter here, or continuing in this chapter, there's an account of the death of Joshua. And it's just repeating what happened, how he died, and so showing that this is the end of the era of Joshua and the beginning of the era of the judges. And you can see the direction that this is going in. And the direction that it's going in, we're going to call this a tragic cycle. Again, we are explaining the era of the judges. You have this tragic cycle here, and the tragic cycle began with sin. Now I'm just going to read a passage here as it goes along. The tragic cycle begins with sin, Judges 2, 10, and 11. After that, the whole generation had gathered to their ancestors. After that whole generation had gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord or what he had done for Israel. They just forgot everything about God. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. And so you have sin. The next thing you have in this cycle is part of the cycle is suffering. That's Judges 2, 14 and 15. So they sinned against God, and then in verse 14 and 15, in his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them and sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. And so they would go from sin to suffering. They would be distressed, and then the suffering would lead to supplication. I've got all S words here. So supplication just means going to God, and it says they were in great distress. And this would cause them to cry out to God because of their of what they were going through, their anxiety that they were dealing with. And then part of the cycle, it would end with salvation. In Judges 2:16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. So let's just take a closer look here at this cycle here. So you see there's a cycle of sin, suffering, and then they would cry out to God, and then God would rise up a judge and bring them out of the persecution that they were undergoing, the judgment that they were facing there. This cycle, so once God would send a judge to save them, the cycle would continue. Let me just continue here in Judges 2:19. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. And so we see this cycle going again and again and again, over and over, around and round, and it's this tragic, deadly cycle that they were going through here again and again. So that is an explanation. The Judges explain. So if you want to understand the book of Judges, as you read through it, you just see this cycle over and over again. Let me present to you another slide here. As you go through the book of Judges, looking as an overview here, you see, let's see, I thought we had, okay, we'll get through this here in just a second here. Okay, we'll get through that in just a moment here. I thought I had a chart there, but I guess I don't. All right, well, that's when we do this live, we don't go back and edit or anything. That's okay. So that brings us to the next part here in your outline, the era of the judges experienced. So this is chapters 3 through 16. So now we have the list of all the different judges in the book of Judges here. So beginning in Judges chapter 3, you begin here with there's a list of the nations that were left to test Israel. So there is a list of different groups of people that were left, and they were the ones that were, according to test Israel. In other words, the Lord used these people groups to teach battle experience to those Israelites who hadn't experienced it yet. Maybe they didn't grow up under Joshua and they hadn't learned the battle experience. But they also served as a test to see whether they would obey the Lord's command or not. And time and again, they failed. And so let me list these out here. Judges 3, 4 through 5 says, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. So you can see here, Israel is in a dark place. They've turned from the Lord. They have no interest in serving God until they feel enough pain, and then they cry out for help, and the cycle starts all over again. So here is the cycles. I moved ahead of myself here. So there are 7 cycles in Judges. We used that chart earlier there, and that chart is on your back of your page. It should be on page 2 of your outline. And so you can see who I'll see if I can get my cursor over this here so you can see. So you can see here, this is the cycle. You can see who the oppressor was, the list of different groups of people that were oppressing the nation of Israel, how long the oppression lasted, who was the judge or the deliverer during that time that God raised up to help them get out of this mess, and how many years of peace they experienced along the way. So this is the 7 cycles in Judges of sin, suffering, supplication, and salvation. So you can see that there, and that's on your outline. So as we're making our way back here, we'll continue with the rest of this outline here. So now let's just go on and we'll just go judge by judge, and I will give a quick overview of each of the judges so you can understand what they did and what they were about. I think you'll find some of this narrative here kind of foreign to our sensibilities and our way of thinking. This was a different time and a different place, but there's some lessons to be learned. Okay, so the first judge named was Othniel. Othniel was either the nephew or the brother of Caleb. That's one of the 12 spies that came out of Canaan, and he was Israel's first judge. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he freed the Israelites from the king Cushan Rishathan. It's easy for me to pronounce here. And so there was the different kings that was oppressing the nation of Israel. And so the oppression that lasted for 8 years. Othniel overpowered his forces, and they enjoyed some peace for some time. But of course, then they went back to serving the Baals and all of those types of things, the false idols there. Then you have Ehud. Now this one is kind of an interesting one. When I was a youth minister back in the day, there was a time when for junior church, back when I was teaching that some, we did a series called Gross Stories of the Bible, and this was one of them. This is a gross story in the Bible. This is Ehud. His name, it means, where's the glory? What a name that is, you know. But he is most known for two things: being left-handed and brutally killing Elon, the king of the Moabites. So the Moabites were now attacking the Israelites, and so Ehud was sent by Israel with a tribute or a payment to meet with Elon. So he was sent there to meet with the king of the Moabites. And so here is the rest of the story. Those of you who remember Paul Harvey. I'm just going to read this out. Judges 3:17 through 22. So he, that's Ehud, presented tribute to Elon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Elon and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." The king said to his attendants, "Leave us," and they all left. So Ehud, the left-handed man, then approached him while he was still sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, "I have a message from God for you." As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. It's a nice story. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his guts came out. I'll just put it that way. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. So again, gross stories of the Bible. This is a brutal time, all right? So this is you don't put this in a card that you're going to send to somebody. This is not a verse you would include in that. So that's what happened. So we're going to move on to the next one here. Shamgar. This judge only gets one verse, but interesting verse it is, Judges 3:31. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, a cattle prod. So he killed 600 Philistines with a cattle prod. He too saved Israel. So you see this cycle continuing here. Now another interesting judge. This is a female judge. This is Deborah in Judges 4 and 5. Deborah was both a prophetess and a judge. Her name means honeybee. So it's interesting to know this. And she was also the wife of a man named Lapidoth. Deborah was the only female judge. And so Deborah called on a man by the name of Barak to command the Israelite army and attack the leader of Canaan's army. So the leader of Canaan's army, the enemy, the leader of their army, his name was Sisera. So Barak from Israel was to attack Sisera. Barak told Deborah that he would go and lead this battle only if Deborah went with him. Well, she agreed, but she wasn't pleased, and she prophesied that Barak would not get the credit for the victory. Rather, a woman would, which would become an insult in that day, in that culture. So, under the leadership of Barak, Israel routed Sisera's army, the enemy's army, and Sisera fled on foot and ended up in the tent of a woman named Jael, the wife of an ally of Canaan. So Jael gave Sisera some milk, and he fell asleep. So he'd been tired from battle all day. Once he was asleep, she drove a peg through his temple into the ground. So that's what happened, all right? again, gross stories of the Bible. These are just brutal times. And then in chapter 5, Deborah breaks out into a song of praise, and kind of a prophetic thing as well, but she breaks out into this song of praise, and that's what chapter 5 is. In some ways, it's kind of a strange book, so it's interesting to read. Then we get to a very famous judge. Many of you maybe have heard of this one, and this would be Gideon. Israel was being attacked by the Midianites, and God calls up Gideon to be a judge. First of all, Gideon, under God's instruction, tears down the altars of Baal and makes sacrifices to the Lord. Now, even though Gideon was called by God, he is reluctant, and he does this thing called putting out a fleece. And sometimes you may have heard this figure of speech used. And so he said, Lord, I'm going to put out a fleece, and in the morning, if the fleece is wet with dew and the ground is dry around it, I will know that it's you that's talking to me. And so the Lord did that, and then he said, well, I'm going to put out one more fleece. This time, if the fleece is dry and the ground around the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, I will know that it's you, the Lord, is talking to me. Of course, he did that, and finally, Gideon agreed. He goes and he starts to follow the Lord into battle here. So he sets out with an army of 32,000 soldiers. God tells Gideon he has too many men, and he says, you've got to send some of these guys home, and here's how you're going to weed them out. You just tell the soldiers, any of you who are scared can go home. So now, if you told an army, hey, any of you guys have any fear, you can go home, how many would go home? Well, 22,000 men left, leaving Gideon with 10,000. God once again told Gideon, you got too many men. Take them down to the water. Those who lap the water up like a dog, they get on their hands and knees and lick it up like a dog, they get to go home. Those who drink with the cupped hands, they can stay. So 300 of them drank from the cup with cupped hands and lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. So the 300 were given trumpets, jars of clay, and torches. Again, kind of a wild book here, isn't it? So they surrounded the Midianites. They blew their trumpets. They broke their jars. They held up their torches, and they yelled, a sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon. This caused the Midianites to just jump into confusion and fear. And in their confusion, I believe it's supernatural as well, God caused them to start killing one another with their own swords. And then Israel chased them down and put them all to death. So that was that battle. But don't forget, we're in a cycle here. Okay, we see this miraculous victory. Judges 8:33. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-bereth as their god. It just, boom, that quick. The cycle continues. Then we come to the prophet, the judge Tola. Tola arrives on the scene after the time of a man named Abimelech. So here's a wild story from this. Gideon had 70 sons. I can't imagine that. And Abimelech, a son he had with one of his slaves, had them all slaughtered on a stone, except for Jotham, who escaped, attempting to seize power for himself, and he established a Jewish monarchy. So Abimelech governed. He wasn't really a judge. He governed for about 3 years and fought and killed many Israelites who opposed him, and he died fighting against his own people. And then so Tola comes up and arrives on the scene and is a judge for a while after that. Then we have another one here who is Jair. And I'll just read this from Judges 10:3-5. He, Tola, that is, was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havoth Jair. When Jair died, he was buried in Kamon. So we've just got a little bit of them. We knew he was wealthy and He had a lot of donkeys, so that was his job there. So the next one is Jephtha. Now, believe it or not, once again, Israel did evil in the sight of God. They basically worshiped any god except for the one true God. And so when Israel cried out, God replied in Judges 10:14, "Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you're in trouble." So God did respond to them, and Israel did repent, and they got rid of their false gods. And then Jephtha made a very foolish vow in the midst of a battle here. Let me just read this vow. This is Judges 11, 30 and 31. "And Jephtha made a vow to the Lord, 'If you give the Ammonites into my hands,'" that's who was oppressing them at this time, "'whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.'" Then you skip down a few verses here in Judges 11:34. "When Jephtha returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter." And so here he made this crazy, foolish vow. And you say, well, did he actually follow through with this? Well, Judges 11:39. After the 2 months, she went away for a couple of months. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin. Wow. Can you just imagine that? It shows you the depravity here. So, Jephtha likely thought, first of all, just some explanations here. Some people think that he likely thought that the first thing he would see would be livestock and not a person, not his daughter. That would have been common for that to be. Also, it should be understood, it was against God's law to make any such vow. He was not within God's will to do this or to follow through with it whatsoever. But in the wickedness of that generation and in their neglect of God's law, he probably didn't even know it was forbidden and just was clueless. It just shows how depraved humanity can get. So again, I told you this was not a feel-good book here. So Ibzan is the next one here. All we know that he was from Bethlehem. He had 30 sons. And so some scholars believe that Judges intended to demonstrate that each of the tribes of Israel produced a leader at some point. So that's one point that can be made from here. That brings us to the next one, Elon. He led Israel for 10 years and then he died. Not much to say about Elon there. There was Abdon in Judges 12, 13 through 15. He had 40 sons and 30 grandsons who rode on 70 donkeys. Likely very wealthy. So some of these you don't get too much information on. Now, this next one, very famous, and I'm certain that you are familiar with this name, and this is Samson. Now, Samson actually had a miraculous birth. His mother was unable to conceive and was visited by an angel and told that she would have a son and instructed to raise the boy as a Nazirite, not cutting off his hair. In some of the previous lessons, we talked about what it means to do this Nazirite vow, and that's what Samson's parents were to do, to raise him as a Nazirite. And so let me just read you here Judges 13, 24 and 25. "The woman gave birth to a boy, named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him while he was in Mahanadan between Zorah and Eshtaol." So the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. That did not mean that he was spiritual or righteous. It just meant that some supernatural things were happening in his life, that God was causing supernatural things to happen. So as Samuel grew up, he became very impulsive and very lustful. At one time, he demanded that his father get a certain Philistine woman for him as his wife. The Israelites were forbidden from marrying outside of Israel, but he said, no, get her for me. Basically, verbatim, that's what he tells his father. And so, but God even uses Samson's selfishness to his own glory, and this became an avenue through which the Philistines would be confronted by Samson, and many of them would be defeated. So, as we think about Samson here, so let's just look. We're going to list out one of the things that we know about Samson. His hair grew, and the biggest thing about Samson, his feats of strength. He was known as the strong man of the Bible, and so we're going to list out his feats of strength here. So here's a feat of strength here. He killed a lion with his bare hands. Next time he killed 30 Philistines. The burning of the fields. Now, this is not just he set them on fire. He tied 300 foxes together in pairs, tail to tail, fastening torches to each pair. Yeah, again, you don't get this kind of stuff in the New Testament, but it's just kind of interesting, isn't it, here? So there was another slaughter of Philistines that he took care of, and then he killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. And so, again, this does not mean that he was a righteous individual or had good character. It just meant that he had been given some supernatural ability, supernatural strength. There is the Gaza Gate incident in chapter 16 and verse 3. He wanted a prostitute in Gaza. Okay? So, again, showing his character. But he was kept from entering the city. So let me just read this. But Samson lay there until the middle of the night. Then he got up, took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the two posts, tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Now, was he doing this for righteous reasons in and of himself? No, he was selfish and he was lustful. And he was carnal in his thinking here. Then there were the 3 escapes from Delilah. So he would go over and see Delilah, and they were trying to figure out what's the secret to your strength. And he kind of played around with giving a secret. And so there were 3 different times he escaped from Delilah. You can read that of kind of how he did that. And then eventually he told her his secret. If you cut my hair, my strength will be gone. And certainly there was a time when the Spirit of the Lord had left him and he didn't realize it. And then finally, at the end of his life, he killed 3,000 Philistines. When they took him captive, the Philistines took him captive. They gouged out his eyes. They put him in prison. Eventually, his strength began to come back little by little. And at the end of his life, he put his hand between 2 pillars where this great structure where the Philistines were all gathered. He pushed the 2 pillars apart. And in his own death, he killed 3,000 Philistines on that day. So,
yeah, I saw that on TV.
You saw that on TV. Yes, that's been dramatized. That's made for a TV movie there. So, I want to think about this here. What was the secret of Samson's strength? It wasn't that he had a great workout program. The secret of his strength, and I think there's that the Spirit of the Lord began to move in him at that time in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. It was the Spirit of God moving in his life that was the secret of his strength. But what was the secret of his weakness and his failure? In Judges 16:20, and she said, "The Philistines are upon you." Samson said, and he awoke out of his sleep and said, "I will go out and just as other times before and shake myself." And he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. So his secret of his strength was when God took over and gave him strength. The secret of his failure and his weakness was when God departed and didn't realize it. So there is the last judge there. So now we have the time of civil war. And that brings us to this last part where Israel falls apart. So the center section of Judges offers a whole list of flawed heroes. There's some characters here and just some crazy stuff that happen. And they're caught in this depressing cycle over and over again. And the final chapters portray a fallen people seemingly beyond hope of redemption here. And so, first of all, you have, I call this the Old Testament version of the prosperity gospel in Judges chapter 17. A wealthy man named Micah used his money to buy an idol to worship. And then he hired his own Levite. He went out and decided he was going to buy a priest from Israel. He foolishly thought that having his own Levite and buying this would bring him prosperity. And in Judges 17 and verse 13, and Micah said, "And now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest." Well, of course, that did not work out. It ended up in destruction there. And so we're going to see what happens here. So we have a final atrocity here, Judges 18 through 21. Some of the men from the tribe of Dan make off with this guy Micah's idol. So this was the guy we talked about before. He makes off with his idol and his Levite. So he bought an idol, he bought a Levite, thinking he was going to be prosperous, kind of as good luck charms there. So some men from the tribe of Dan, they come in and steal the idol, they steal the Levite. And another Levite takes a concubine from Bethlehem, but after an argument, she returns to her father's house, and the Levite goes to Bethlehem to retrieve her, and he participates in a 5-day drinking binge participates in a 5-day drinking binge with her father and attempts to make his way back home with the concubine before sunset. They stop at a town called Gibeah, which was in Benjamin, but initially couldn't find a place to stay. Finally, they were taken in by an old man. And so in Judges 19:22, while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring the man who came out to your house so we can have sex with him." So see the depravity of the people here that's going on. The old man, instead of just saying, "Hey, get out of here," the old man offered his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to the wicked men. Again, this is foreign to me how this could happen. This poor woman was raped and killed. And so the Levite took her home, and when he got her home, he cut her up limb by limb and sent her to all of the areas of Israel, claiming that the Benjamites were the ones who cut her up. So this is Israel fighting against each other. So this horrible thing here, it's hard to follow. It's just so sordid and kind of crazy here. So all the tribes of Israel converged on Benjamin. 25,000 Benjamite swordsmen were killed, and only 600 escaped. So the men of Israel put all of Benjamin's towns to the sword and to set them on fire. This is civil war. They're fighting each other about this. And so in chapter 21, the attacking tribes had some regret for killing their fellow Israelites. They kind of thought about it. And since all the women of Benjamin were wiped out through this attack, the other tribes provided wives for the surviving men who survived of the tribe of Benjamin. And so the men of Benjamin were given permission to forcefully take wives for themselves during an annual festival to the Lord at Shiloh. Do you see how twisted and demented the people had become? So I realized that was probably hard to follow because there was just so many things going on, death and destruction and depravity here. So that brings us down to the applications here. So here's the applications. Here's what we learn from Judges. When left to their own devices, people can descend into unimaginable evil. You know, we think, how could people be this horrible as you look at the book of Judges? These horrible things they did. But you know, it's less than a century ago, and we dealt with 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. And we could think, how could anybody do this? And there are atrocities that take place all the time. Even today, there are atrocities that take place. And it happens when we are left to our own devices and we choose to disregard God. And then the next application is this: God is our ultimate deliverer. You look here at what was taking place in the book of Judges, and I don't see how God had the patience that he did. It seemed to me you would just wipe them off the face of the earth for what they were doing. But you see also the fact that he didn't wipe them off the face of the earth is that it's a sign of the grace of God. And so one of my favorite passages is found in Romans chapter 5. We'll close out with this. Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. You see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So this is a very, very dark chapter in the history of God's people, in the history of Israel. And I think we can take warning from this, that all of us, at some time, we have the capacity to rebel against God. And left to our own devices, if we choose to ignore God, amazing, just unimaginable atrocities can take place. But we do see a picture of God's grace in this. God is our ultimate deliverer. So that is the other part of this. The ultimate deliverer we have is the deliverance we have through Christ.